Recording in progress. So let's start then with our event. I hope you can see my screen. Can you just nod or something? Yes, okay, thank you. So welcome to German Language Society. This is now the second event of the year. As always, we are meeting on the last Thursday at 7:30 p.m. British time. So that's just a normal introduction and reminder. As you know, we do events mainly in German, but here and now we do it also in English. Where you can find everything about our events, it's on the Tirol page, where you have our German Language Society. And so far we have quite some events listed. For example, Walter and I were really diligent and hardworking for the first half of the year. Today we will speak about England and the Hanse past and present, thanks to Richard, but we will come back to that. Next month we will speak about art, about Kunst, but this will be in German, and then we have some interesting guests as well. And all this can be found on the website, Tirol website. Because in July we will have a topic about the councillor and the chancellor. I kindly ask those who are interested in that to read or listen the book from it's written by Ursula Weidenfeld, Die Kanzlerin, Portrait einer Epoche. It's about the chancellor. It's really good book. It's like, you know, kind of memoir, what she did, how she managed, you know, her background a little bit. I think it's interesting because she was kind of person, I would say, of the politics and a woman. We have some rules, so we try to, you know, when we always have discussion at the end, so that we, you know, everybody can ask or share opinion or something. But the most important thing is that we stay, you know, close to the topic, that we don't, you know, swim away into some strange topics. And yes, Walter, what shall I say? Today, England and the Hanse past and present. Our guest is Dr. Paul Richards. Walter, would you like to take over here?
Yes, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our event today. And there are many who meet with us today, and would be interesting to get to know where you are based. But first and foremost, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Paul Richards, the local historian and author and town guide of King's Lynn in Hanseatic town. It's actually a merit of the previous organizers of the CIOL study weekends, Jadwiga Bobrowska and I think Stephanie Tarling, who found Paul Richards to invite him one time to Lübeck, and the other time he nearly hosted the study weekend at King's Lynn in 2019. So I have been in touch with Paul Richards for some other reasons, and he told me and he wrote me that he has written a book and published a book, a new book. And so I tried to invite him, and he accepted this invitation, and I'm very grateful also on your behalf to have him here today. Paul Richards was born and bred in King's Lynn, and he studied for both BA and PhD degrees in history at Birmingham University, followed by a teacher training at Nottingham. Paul taught in further and higher education at the College of West Anglia. He has been a part-time tutor for the WEA, the Open University, and university extra departments. He was a borough councillor of King's Lynn and West Norfolk and the mayor of that town from 1998 to 2000, before becoming an honorary alderman. His history of King's Lynn as a publication was published in 1990, and he has written articles on local and regional history for various publications. Amongst them, there are several other interests, He is a trustee of the Trews Yard Fisherfolk Museum. Those who were at King's Lynn, they might have gone to see that, to visit that museum. And he's also a member of the King's Lynn Festival, the Hanseatic, the Hanse Festival, which is held every year. He is in the board of that festival, and he is a town guide, and we were also enjoying his town guide tour while in King's Lynn. So please, Paul, feel free to start with your lecture.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to talk a brief introduction, and then I'm going to show some slides, which Romana will kindly show for me, and I'll let her know when to go to the next slide. My interest in the Hanse in England was really in 1972 when I was at Nottingham University, and the King's Lynn has the only medieval German Hanse house in England. And I was aware of the Hanseatic League, but in 1972, the Hanseatic warehouses were restored. And my mother wrote to me. My mother passed away in 2020. She was 101, but she wrote to me and said, Paul, you'll be interested in this. And I suddenly realized that England and the Hanseatic League has a story to be told. There are one or two books, it is mentioned, but people in England traditionally see the Hanseatic League as a German-centered organization. What about the English towns on the East Coast, as well as London? What really was the role we played? How important was King's Lynn in this role? And gradually, I got into this. A big thing was when I was mayor in 1998, I'd visited Lübeck in 1997 to meet Professor Dr. Klaus Friedland. And he became my teacher and mentor of Hanseatic history. So I tended to see Hanseatic history from the German point of view, as well as studying in King's Lynn. And I became a member of the Hanseatic History Union, the Hansische Geschichtsverein, which Klaus Friedland was very much the major influence. And in 1998, they came to King's Lynn for one of their very rare conferences outside Germany. So they came to King's Lynn in 1998 for a Hanseatic symposium with speakers from Germany and Holland and Poland, as well as from this country, from England. And that really got me going. And then we joined the new Hanseatic League in 2005. And in 2005, we had our first replica ship. It came from Kiel, the Kieler Hansekogge, a replica ship based on the ship dug up, excavated at Bremen after 1962. I was very excited. I went on board the ship, but after 3 or 4 days, and went into the North Sea and sailed around the North Sea, and then came back on the ship. I even took the rudder for a while, and then we came back and went to see Boston across the Wash from King's Lynn. And then in 2009, we had another ship, the Lisa von Lübeck, which is not a replica, it's a representation. But from Lübeck, a bigger ship, a caravel, 15th century. The Kieler Kogge is 14th century, and we know from the wood that it was the wood was sawn down. The trees were sawn down in 1380. But the Lisa von Lübeck is a representation of a 15th century ship. And then in 2015, we had another replica ship, this time from the Netherlands, from Kampen. Kampen joined the Hanseatic League in 1441, one of those Dutch towns on the River Yssel. And the Dutch, after the Second World War, have excavated a number of medieval ships in the Zuider Zee and elsewhere. And in Kampen, they were the first to build this replica ship in the Netherlands, and it came to King's Lynn in 2015. And I went to Kampen for the Hansetag the next year and met all my friends again. So I gradually got more into this, and I thought, well, this is all exciting stuff. It needs to be promoted. It needs to be talked about. So as a town guide, I wrote a Hanseatic trail. The Borough Council of King's Lynn printed a leaflet And now I take people around the town on a Hanseatic trail. I give talks. I gave a talk this afternoon at the Fisherfolk Museum to a group about England and the Hanseatic League. I gave a lecture on England and the Hanseatic League in London at Gresham College in 2007. And in the audience was a man called Nikolaus Schuss, who was a leading member at that time of the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce, the Hamburg Handelskammer. And he invited me to Hamburg. So apart from the last 2 years, for several years, I've been to Hamburg to Hanseatic events. And in 2016, I was invited to give a talk on England and the Hanseatic League in the Chamber of Commerce in Hamburg. And in their annual publication, it was printed. So I got an essay about England and the Hanseatic League in the Morgensprache magazine. And then at the conference, at the Hanse festivals in King's Lynn, we always have, apart from children's activities, apart from tours, apart from music, we have lectures. In 2018, we had Angela Huang from the European Hanse Museum in Lübeck. And in 2006, 2015, when the Dutch ship was here, we had 4, 5, 6 good speakers, and that was turned into a book, and it's called 6 Essays in Hanseatic History. And it's still on sale in King's Lynn. It was published in 2017. And Walter referred to my book. I've had other things published. Dr. Rolf Hamel-Kiesow, who sadly died, I think it was last year, a book was dedicated to him while he was alive about all his contribution to German Hanseatic history. And the 2 authors in Lübeck invited me to contribute an essay in that book, published in Lübeck. It was called Hanse und Stadt. And so I'm very proud that I had an essay printed there. It was in English, I'm afraid. All the rest was in German. But I also learn a lot every year through the journal of the Hanseatic History Union, which comes to me, and I always keep updated. But at last, my book is called England and the German Hanse, a study in medieval trade and politics, and it will be published this May. I have a publisher. After all these years of not getting round to finishing it because of too many meetings and research, I've now finished the book, and it will be published in about 3 months' time. And the mayor is going to give me a civic launch at the town hall, and I'll have another launch at the Hanse House, and do my best to promote my enthusiasm in all this again. So now I'm going to start showing, because I know time is limited, I'm going to start showing some slides. So I'm going to ask Romana if we could have number 1 slide, please. I think I've got on my screen, I need to get rid of this. This is being recorded. Alison will help me here. I need to get rid of this, Alison. Do I just do that? Got it. Got it.
Yes, got it.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. That's gone now. On your screen, you'll see a map. This will appear in my book. It's Northern Europe, of course, in the Middle Ages, and expanding east and west. And you can see King's Lynn and Boston on the Wash, that big bay on the east coast of England, the Wash it's called. Lynn and Boston were very important destinations for German ships in the 13th century and right through to the 16th century, although London took over more and more. But on this map, you can see right at the top is Bergen. That was the biggest German Hanse base outside Germany. And also in Russia on the far right, in the top far right corner, you can see Novgorod. Novgorod important for furs, whereas Bergen was fish, of course. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see 2 cities which made up the 4 big trading posts of the German Hanse, which they depended upon for their maritime seaborne empire, trading empire. Bruges, and you can say Bruges was the cradle of European capitalism. It was a big market, the main market for English wool in the 13th century, and not far from Bruges is London. And the German merchants came to London for English wool. English wool was regarded as the best, and so that was the main export of England in the 13th and 14th centuries, until cloth became more important export, which was just as keenly bought in Europe. So you have the Hanseatic towns. Of course, most of those towns, there were 40 smaller trading posts. You have the 4 big trading posts I talked about, and you have another 40 smaller trading posts. And on the east coast of England, you can see the towns. They're not labelled, though. Apart from London, there was Ipswich, Colchester, Yarmouth, Lynn, Boston, and Hull. So the German Hanse depended on this network of trading posts to make it work. Most Hanseatic towns were inland, as you can see, in Western Germany. They knew nothing about King's Lynn. They knew nothing about Boston. But the important thing is this, is that Bremen, Hamburg, Wismar, Rostock, and Gdansk, Danzig in particular, they're the leading Hanseatic towns, and Cologne is not on the map, but Cologne as well. These major centres of the Hanse, they did trade with King's Lynn. So King's Lynn and Boston were involved with the most important Hanseatic towns, but many Hanseatic towns were small towns on rivers in Germany, and they traded mainly through the bigger ports. So that's Northern Europe. Thank you, Romana. A quick word on Lübeck. I have a very nice friend. He died 5 years ago. His name was Sid Swan. He married a German lady called Isla just after the Second World War. He was in the British Army in Lübeck, and he knows it so well, and he acquired the German language to such an extent that Professor Dr. Friedland, when they met in King's Lynn in 2009, Klaus didn't believe that Sid was English. He was convinced he was German. So good was his German language. And Lübeck was largely rebuilt after 1276, when there was a fire which destroyed a large part of the city. The population in 1276 was roughly about 15 or 16,000. Bigger than Hamburg, but smaller, much smaller than Cologne, which was the biggest Hanseatic city. And of course, here in Lübeck, Lübeck became the capital, but only informally, not in a strong way, because the Hanseatic League, or the German Hanse, was not bound together very strongly. In fact, latest research emphasizes the divisions within the German Hanse, the different interests, and it was rather a loose association of towns, but nevertheless an important one, because together they could negotiate with foreign countries and get better trade deals. And also they needed to cooperate against pirates. But one final thing about Lübeck, after 1358, the Hanseatic League as such only begins in 1358. Excuse me. That's when the cities got together and started to have annual conferences. And most of those conferences were in Lübeck, and they were here at the City Hall, and they weren't just business meetings. There was dancing and feasting. They were major events, and each city, including places like Riga, which joined the Hanseatic League in the late 13th century, or joined the Hanse, people came from Riga, Cologne, all over the Hanseatic world. They came here for the annual conference. There were 1 or 2 annual conferences in Stralsund and in Hamburg and Bremen, but most of the conferences were in Lübeck, including the last Hanseatic conference. You could call it a parliament, with all cities represented by 2 people. The last one, there was only Bremen, Hamburg, and Lübeck left, and so the last Hanseatic assembly was in 1669, until the revival of the new Hanse in 1980. Thank you, Romana. Thank you. Next slide, please. There we are. Here's the ship. Now, this is that Kieler Hansekogge, built in Kiel. Experienced carpenters, some were brought out of retirement to train young people to build this ship. It was built in Kiel, based on the one excavated in Bremen in 1962, after 62 to 66, 67. And it's 24 meters long, nearly 9 meters in width, and can carry about 150 tons. So on these ships to King's Lynn was brought wax and timber and tar, fish and ale, beer, everything, almost everything, of course, being in barrels, 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 barrels. The Hanseatic towns in King's Lynn and Boston had barrels everywhere. In Hamburg, in the 15th century, there were 500 breweries. So you can imagine the number of barrels in Hamburg. But these ships not only brought Baltic goods to England in return for wool and salt, they also had passengers to King's Lynn because many were pilgrims. I've been to St. James's Church in Hamburg. I know a little bit about pilgrimage, and pilgrims from Northern Europe, many came on Hanseatic ships to King's Lynn because near where I'm sitting, only 23 miles from where I am, is Walsingham, which is called England's Nazareth. And with Canterbury was one of the biggest pilgrimage in medieval England. And many pilgrims came on Hanseatic ships to King's Lynn, and then they would walk to Walsingham. And Henry VIII stopped that in 1536. Pilgrimages were forbidden. Oh, by the way, the name King's Lynn, we were called Bishop's Lynn until Henry VIII in 1537 got rid of the bishops, or got rid of some of them, and he said, this is my town. So 1537, you went to bed one night living in Bishop's Lynn, and the next day you woke up and you were in King's Lynn after Henry VIII. Thank you, Romana. And this is London. I'm sorry, it's not a very great slide, but in the foreground is the River Thames. And you might be able to distinguish centre left, the steel yard, and that was the German trading post. It's one of the 4 great trading posts. So Novgorod, Bergen, Bruges, and London. And it grew and grew. So by the 15th century was rather a large chunk on the banks of the Thames near the Tower of London. And here, by the 15th century, it was started by merchants from Cologne in 1175. And a very important point is this: the English kings, the medieval kings of England, wanted the Hanse because of the national wealth it brought with trade, but also the German merchants were very wealthy, many of them, and they borrowed money from them. And Edward III in the mid-14th century actually pawned the crown jewels of England to the Hanse. And they were kept in, the crown jewels of England were kept in Bruges. Some of the Lynn merchants helped to get them back and paid the debt off. So these German merchants had luxury goods as well as bulk commodities here in London, and they were very popular with the court of all the, because they could get jewels and fine cloth and fine clothes. And the steel, it's called the Steel Yard, or in people in Hamburg, Hamburg and Lübeck merchants were granted their own Hanses here in the 1260s, and it's called in the Hamburg merchants in the Hanseatic Union in Hamburg. I know the people there quite well. They call it the London Stahlhof, and it was closed finally by Elizabeth, but then it came back to the German merchants. But it was finally, and unfortunately, we lost it because in the 1860s, it was demolished for Cannon Street railway station. I don't know how well you know the City of London, but it's in Dowgate Ward. A friend of ours, Alison Gowman, she is the alderman for Dowgate Ward, and we met her in Hamburg, and are friends of hers now. She's now, this year, she is Sheriff of the City of London, maybe Lord Mayor next year. And she's very interested in the Hanse. So with her and her friends, we go to Hamburg, or did before the epidemic, before COVID started. We went to Hamburg every year, and I began to realize and did understand how closely the City of London and the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce had been for many years. I hadn't known anything about this, but now I've learned a lot about it. It's just a shame that the last 2 years we've not been able to attend these autumn meetings with a lecture and presentations and so on, usually in the Chamber of Commerce. But the last time we met, I think 2019, it was in the Hamburg Maritime Museum, which I like very much. Thank you. Thank you, Romana. And this is East Anglia. Look at King's Lynn at the top. You can see before the, imagine this, no tarmac roads, no railways. How do you move timber, barrels of fish? Barrels of ale, pitch, tar? How do you move these things? And it's by water, isn't it? So you can see the river system, that King's Lynn and Boston between them, the German merchants could get access to half of England, over 25 counties. King's Lynn's hinterland is there, and you can see we are the port of Cambridge. We are the port of Northampton, the port of Bury St Edmunds, the port of Bedford, the port of Peterborough, until the railways came and took all that trade away from King's Lynn. But the German merchants wanted to be in King's Lynn and Boston more than London at first. The northern Germans came to here, to Lynn and Boston. The merchants from the Rhineland, Cologne and the Rhineland, they were mainly the ones who went to London. And you can see the hinterland, all the wool coming down the rivers and all the cloth later, and a salt was made around King's Lynn because the Baltic wasn't very salty and they needed lots of salt for the herring fishery there, which was a big thing for Lübeck. Lübeck's, I think a nickname of Lübeck is Heringstadt. And so here we are. This is where the German Hanse wanted to be, and they stayed in King's Lynn until the middle of the 16th century, when London began to attract all the German merchants. Thank you, Romana. And this is an upside down map of Europe. You probably haven't seen one like this before, but on the right, you can see United Kingdom and King's Lynn. And right, if you draw a line across, it goes right to the Baltic. You can see how well positioned King's Lynn is to enter the Baltic. By the 15th century, Danzig was by far the most important Hanseatic port for King's Lynn. In fact, in Danzig was a colony of English merchants. The English had a whole quarter of the city, and the biggest group of English merchants in Danzig were the Lynn merchants. And the Lynn merchants went to Danzig, and of course the Germans had come to England. Now the English were going to Danzig, and there were some problems because the kings of England gave the German merchants tax concessions, whereas when the English got to Danzig in Prussia, all this is in my book. This is chapter 3 in my book. It's called Lynn's Prussia Connection. And they dealt with the Teutonic Knights, because the Teutonic Knights were the rulers of Prussia. But Danzig got independence in 1457. But you can see another problem. In the middle of the map is Denmark, and you can see Jutland. And getting around the Danish kings through the narrow straits between Sweden and Denmark, they taxed ships going through, and that caused a problem. So there were wars. There were wars between the Hanseatic towns in Denmark and between, and also the Dutch were involved because the Dutch got into the Baltic as well. So, and also a final point, there were lots of pirates. There was a group of pirates who came from, I hope Walter doesn't mind me saying so, but came from Rostock and Wismar, or at least Rostock and Wismar harbored them. And they were originally linked to the Dukes of Mecklenburg, and the Vitalian brothers, they were called, with a man called Störtebeker. And they were a menace, especially in the late 14th century in the Baltic, and then later in the North Sea. So piracy was a constant threat to trade, and as was international incidents between Denmark and the Hanse towns, and between the Dutch towns and the Hanse towns. So sea voyages were dangerous, but in 6 months, you could come from King's Lynn to Danzig and back twice in 6 months. Although Hanseatic ships often didn't sail in the winter because of ice in the Baltic, but they could do a round trip in that time. The ships were owned sometimes by German and English merchants. Despite the problems over taxation, the English and German merchants cooperated. They owned ships together. When Lynn merchants went to Danzig, many of them lived in the houses of the German merchants. And of course, German people came to King's Lynn, and in the 15th century, there were at least 40 German shoemakers in King's Lynn, probably people who had been sailors and were caught in the port because of a bad winter and stayed in King's Lynn and used their skills from mending sails and so on. They used their skills to make shoes, which shoemaking being such a huge industry in the medieval period, of course, lots of little shoemaking shops, cobbler shops. So the trade between Lynn and Gdansk is full of people. Families went from England to live in Gdansk as well. There was lots of traffic of all kinds, not just commercial, between Lynn and the Hanseatic towns in the Baltic, including Stralsund. Stralsund was also a very important destination for Lynn ships. Stralsund had important shipyards, and Lynn merchants bought ships from the Danzig shipyards. They also bought ships from the Stralsund shipyards. And in the 15th century, some Hanseatic towns wanted this to stop. They thought that letting the English buy their ships was increasing competition. So the whole history of Lynn and Danzig is a great story to be told. Thank you. Next slide, please. And Danzig, here is the Great Crane. I don't know if you've been to Gdansk. We went in 2011, the King's Lynn Hanseatic Club. We had a civic reception. We had tours of the city, and were told how much it had been destroyed in 1945. It had to be largely rebuilt. And this is called the Great Crane of Danzig, which also put ship masts into ships and was a gateway into the city as well. Today, well, it was in 2011, it's a major element in the Polish Maritime Museum. And the river in front of you is called the Motlava, which was deepened and widened. As Hanseatic ships got bigger, some of the rivers had to be dug deeper and widened, and that happened in Gdansk. And you have to go, the other part of the Polish Maritime Museum is opposite. So you get on a little rowing boat and go across the river to go into the other part of the Polish Maritime Museum. And one of the things we were told a lot about was amber. Amber became a major export from Gdansk, Danzig to England. And Danzig was taken over more or less in 1309 by the Teutonic Knights. But eventually the city ejected the Teutonic Knights, and in the 1450s came under the authority of the kings of Poland. And in 1457, the Polish kings gave the Danzigers more or less autonomy. They were left alone to make their own way in the world and make the money. But the Danzigers were also very involved in taxation of ships for the other towns in the German Hanse, and the taxation was used to fight pirates. So there were special Hanseatic ships, warships, which were had to be paid for, and they paid for these ships by taxing all the ships coming in and out of ports, especially Danzig. And pirates in the 14th century, in particular, were a big menace to German ships, English ships, and Dutch ships. So our visit to Gdansk was a very fruitful one and much enjoyed. Thank you. And this is King's Lynn Town Hall. Just to quickly say, this is 1440s. But what I'd like to tell you is that as early as 1271, some of the merchants here, who were called burgesses of King's Lynn, I suppose it's like a dual citizenship. Some were German merchants. And there was a man called Stavoren, Stephen Stavoren, S-T-A-V-E-R-E-N, maybe from Stavoren in Holland, but we think he was a Hamburg man. He was certainly in London at the German trading post there, but came to King's Lynn, and he said in letters to Lübeck, he says he represented all the Lübeck merchants in England. And that was in 1271, suggesting that Lynn was at that time the most important HQ of the German Hanse. And I think it was for the northern Germans, not for Cologne. Cologne people went to London, but for the North Germans in the 13th century, Lynn and Boston were just as important, more important to the German Hanse than London, although later London became more important. And in this building, there were groups of Lynn merchants. We had our own Hanses. The word Hanse was used in England in the 12th and 13th century. The Hanse, for example, in Lynn, there was a group of merchants who went to Iceland. In the 15th century, the Iceland Hanse, Bergen Hanse, Bordeaux for wine. and many German Hanse ships went to, after they'd come to Lynn with Baltic goods, if they went in ballast, they often went to France for wine. And there was a big Hanseatic fleet every year bringing wine and salt from Spain and Portugal to the Baltic. And of course, there was a Netherlands Hanse and a Danzig Hanse. So the Lynn merchants had their own little Hanses and traveled together all over Northern Europe, especially from the late 14th century, when the English started to build bigger and better ships and started to compete in some ways with the German Hanse. This building still survives today. It was rebuilt after a fire in 1421, and it's a wonderful medieval hall. And I have given many talks in here, including to a group of people from Lübeck about 5 years ago, because Lynn has been sending to the annual, they called Hansetags. This year it's in Neuss in Western Germany. Lynn has attended many before the epidemic, and we've had a stall and told everyone about King's Lynn and shown films. As a result, we've had the Soroptimist Society from Lübeck, a choir from Lübeck, and other people have come to King's Lynn, all sadly disrupted by the recent epidemic, but hopefully it can restart again in the next year or so. Thank you. This is the great church of Lynn, King's Lynn Minster, and you can see on the left of the picture is, this is early 18th century. This is the Hanseatic warehouse or Hanseatic trading post, which has been rebuilt. The front has been rebuilt by the German Hanse, and the English smaller trading posts were controlled from London, from the London contour. Unfortunately, the spire you see there, on the 8th of September, 1741, there was an amazing, horrible storm, and it fell into the church. So the church is a bit smaller than it was as you see it. But in the middle of the church is the great lantern, based on that in Ely Cathedral. And that was an amazing wooden structure. And when you had important people come to King's Lynn, they were taken to the balcony of that so they could view the town. And we have some accounts from 17th century diaries about that. But this is the church which the German merchants would have used, and also probably many of them would have been buried here, because Hanseatic merchants were buried abroad, of course. If they died abroad, they were buried abroad. But I'll show you in a second where we know the German merchants were buried more than they were here. Thank you, Romana. And here it is. This is the drawing of 1806. Lynn had 4 great friaries, and this is the Franciscan friaries, and the Lübeckers in particular were keen on the Franciscans, and there's still a church in Lübeck, of course, an old Franciscan church. The Franciscans, this was the early 15th century tower, and it survived the Reformation. Henry VIII, as you probably know, closed about 900 religious buildings in England, but the tower of the church here, of the friars, the Franciscans, that survived because it was a sea mark. Ships out in the North Sea could line up on it to make sure they got to Lynn, and so that's why it survived. But in the courtyard of these, in the precincts of these Franciscan houses were lay burials, and many merchants in Lynn did not like the bishops of Norwich and preferred not to be buried in the great church of St. Margaret. They preferred to be buried here. And my belief is, I haven't got enough evidence yet, my belief is that, well, I do know that many younger merchants and certainly sons of English merchants became friars. And here, I am sure that the Hanseatic merchants were buried and funerals were in the friary church. Thank you. Thank you, Romana.
It's very interesting to listen into it. I've just been sorting my accounts as well, because I've got a little bit of a backlog here. And the DW.
Excuse me, can somebody mute themselves? Because we hear you speaking. It's a lady. I don't know who.
Here we are. Okay. Here we are with it's a town plan of King's Lynn, and in the middle you can see the great church of St. Margaret. It was renamed or remade as King's Lynn Minster in 2011, and the other black square just to the top left is the town hall, and the Hanse House is opposite the church, although not marked. So isn't it interesting? You had the great church representing mainly the bishops of Norwich. That's the rulers of King's Lynn. You had the town hall where the merchants of Lynn, the lay rulers, the great merchants were, and we had across the street, we had the Hanseatic Trading Post representing the international organization called the German Hanse. Thank you. And that's a view of the German Hanse. That's the Hanse House, looking into the courtyard. After there was one sea war, 1474, 1468 to 74, it was ended by the Treaty of Utrecht, and the German delegation at Utrecht in the Netherlands were asked what did they want. They did a deal, you know, the English and Germans did a deal to bring this war to an end. The French and Dutch were also involved. It was mainly in the Channel with about 19 ships on either side, merchant ships turned into warships. It wasn't on land or anything like that. But the German delegation led by Castorp, the mayor of Lübeck, who'd been mayor of Lübeck for over 30 years and had 30 years experience negotiating with foreign countries to maintain Hanseatic links and privileges, economic privileges. And they said, we want our London trading post back, we want our Boston trading post back, and we want a new trading post in King's Lynn. So the King of England bought this area and gave it, transferred it to the German Hanse in 1475. The German Hanse demolished the buildings, and the two long warehouses running to the river date from about 1476 to 1478, built by the German Hanse. They were the warehouses where they stored their goods, and of course upriver was Cambridge and Bedford as well. And in Lübeck did a count of German merchants in England in around about 1480, and there were 41 German merchants based in this building. But you can see the front of the building is Georgian, because in 1751, the Germans finally sold the building, and the new owner was a Lynn merchant, and he rebuilt the street range in the shape of the Georgian house you can see there. So this is the Hanse House. Thank you. And that's a view from the top of the church. So you're now looking down into the Hanse House. Behind you is the River Great Ouse. It's the third longest river in England. It rises near Oxford. It flows through the English Midlands. Bedford is on the River Ouse, for example. Cambridge is just off it, linked by the River Cam. Ely is on the River Ouse. So you must imagine this river as the highway, with lots and lots of goods from the Baltic going upriver to 9 or 10 English counties, and coming downriver, lots and lots of wool and lots of grain. In times of bad harvest in Europe, East Anglia has always been a breadbasket. Grain, lots of grain was exported, and also ale on occasions. But that is the Hanse House today, this was taken 5 years ago, and it was bought in 2011 by Mr. James Lee, a friend of mine. And so the Hanse House, as you see it now, are apartments. There is offices, citizens advice bureau, and there's a restaurant. And those of you who came to King's Lynn in 2019 of your group, of course, know this place. We did a tour, didn't we? And we had something to eat in the Rathskeller. The Rathskeller is the restaurant at the top of the Hanse House near the river. And altogether, a very fine building, a very important building. It's grade 1 listed. King's Lynn has 13 grade 1 listed buildings, which is exceptional for a town of 50,000. And this is of special interest because it is unique in England. There are churches which are like St. Margaret's around England and St. Nicholas, but this is unique because in England, there is no other Hanse House. Thank you. And this is the Hanse Festival 2009. This is the St. Margaret's Church in the background. This is the Lise von Lübeck leaving King's Lynn and firing its cannon. And a very successful visit. Many people boarded and studied it. And on board, the crew had shops and all sorts of interesting things. The hold, the sleeping area, was in the hold, but during the day, it was turned into a little restaurant. So I remember having breakfast there with various people. And so that was 2009. We tried to get it back this year, but they're not ready to come back again. So now we're concentrating on getting another ship next year because of COVID and the epidemic and all the problems it's caused. We're hoping, we're in King's Lynn, we have a good relationship with the German embassy, and we're hoping the German embassy will help us financially, but we have been able to raise money for these ships to come, and we will do so again. So we're hoping to have the Lisa von Lübeck, or maybe a ship from Bremen, which was particularly close to King's Lynn. Bremen and King's Lynn are very closely associated in the Middle Ages. It would be nice. It has 2 replica ships. It'd be very good if we could get one of the Bremen ships to come. But we shall see. We have to concentrate our energy on next year now. But we do have a Hanse festival this year. On the 12th of June, we have the King's Lynn Hanse Festival. We had one late last year, but only sort of not a big one. And 2020, of course, was cancelled. So we've had Hanse festivals every year since 2004, except, of course, 2020. Thank you. And the King's Lynn Hanse, this is the parade in 2009. We have in King's Lynn about nearly 1,000 people from the Baltic states. And of course, the towns there, some of the towns there were in the Hanseatic League or the German Hanse. And we get them to come along, and we have the German flag and the Dutch flag. Lynn has many Dutch connections as well as connections to Germany through the Hanse. And you can see the town hall in the background. And we start the day by having this procession of the Hanseatic procession from one marketplace. We have one big marketplace called the Tuesday Marketplace. This is the smaller, older one called the Saturday Marketplace. And in the 13th century, it was a major wool market, and many German merchants came to England to be here in this marketplace to buy English wool. And some people have written stuff about it, quite important. And you can see we have music in the foreground there. But we're now going past the church. The church is on the right. And as it was a Sunday and a church service was going on, we were told, and we quite understood this, we had to stop the music while we passed the church. But as you can see, it was a very fine day. And the man in the middle with the flag is Nick Daubney, who was on the Hanseatic Commission today. He has recently retired from that, but he's been closely involved with the Hanseatic affairs in Lübeck and elsewhere over the last 12 years, 15 years. So you can see on the left an Iceland flag as well. So we really try and make the Hanse Festival special. It's always very, very popular, but mostly it's most popular when we have a ship. And people always say, when is the ship coming? So we've got to try really hard to get one of the replica ships from Germany or from the Netherlands next year. I think that's it. I think that's the last slide. It is. There we are. That's the slide. Time goes so quickly.
It was I found it very interesting and an impressive presentation, highly informative. And of course, you could still continue if we had time. And,
yes.
But maybe we can ask you questions if
yes.
you.
Yes.
So please feel free. Maybe I can have a start.
Yes.
Can you tell me what a representation is? It was. This is not a replica. But
Walter,
you
can you
told in the beginning
question?
that it is a.
Walter, can you repeat the question?
Yes, my question is, Paul, can you please tell us what a representation is? It's about the ship.
Yes.
It's not a replica. What is the difference?
Yes. Well, a replica ship is based exactly on the ship you find. For example, the ships excavated in Bremen And in some of the
Yes,
Dutch towns,
I see.
you can tell what sort of wood it was, everything about it, how long it was, how wide it was. So you build a ship which is a replica. A representation is when you don't have an archaeological ship. You haven't found one.
Right.
And
Okay.
the German towns have not yet dug up a 15th century ship. So the Lise von Lübeck is a representation of a 15th century ship, and the hull of that ship is actually based on the English ship, the Mary Rose. But one day they will dig one up. Here in the Wash, I live on the river here, and not far from where we think there are 300 historic ships at the bottom of the Wash. And I'm sure there are 1 or 2 German cogger. And if we dig one up, we will try and make one. It costs €1 million to build a ship.
I think we have one in Wismar, but they do not dare to cross the channel, and because they are not navigable.
Yes.
I would thank you very much. I would like to appreciate also that you gave us not only the impression of the German Hanse, but you gave us also a European dimension of this Hanse period, and this is, I think, something that can only be appreciated, especially in these days. And I think the new Hanse also tries to continue the relationships between the cities and the states and the countries. And this is a very, very, very good and valuable part of society, I think. In Europe, the more than UK has left the political Europe, but it's the geographical Europe that counts, actually.
Yes, yes. Well, there are 100.
Thank you very much for this
yes.
point.
Well, Walter, there are, in the new Hanse, which was started in 1980 in the Netherlands, there are 196 towns, 196 towns. And Lynn was the first English town to join, 2005. There are now 6 English towns.
That's
and we're trying to form, that's Ipswich, Yarmouth, Lynn, Boston, Hull and Beverley. We're trying to form an English Hanse, so we have greater clout in Europe to do deals. And one of the interesting aspects of this is the port. Here in King's Lynn, not far from where I'm sitting, is the port of King's Lynn. And it still trades with Hamburg. It trades with Lübeck. It trades with Danzig, Gdansk. We are still trading with these cities. And we would like to get the port manager together. And the idea is, if we can get the port managers together in England and Germany, maybe we can do more trade together. And also cultural. On the ships you saw, and certainly by the 16th century, German musicians came to England on these ships. English Shakespearean play actors went to Germany in the 17th century. English actors and musicians played in Hamburg. Lübeck violinists in the 17th century played in London. So there was cultural exchange then, not just commercial exchange. And the pilgrimage traffic was enormous until it was suppressed.
Thank you very much for this point, which is very important in these days to support peaceful relationships.
Yes.
So any other questions? Anna, I think you gave us a comment that Hans Holbein painted. Some of whom did he paint, representative of the Hanse? Maybe you can give us more information. I think it was Anna who wrote this on the chat.
Yes. Do you want me to?
Feel free to ask questions or give us your comments.
Yes. Hans Holbein painted, we know Hans Holbein, who came back to London in 1532, we know he painted definitely 7 Hanseatic merchants in London. They're called the Steelyard Portraits. And he his most famous one for us in England is of a Danzig merchant called George Giza, and his painting is wonderful. Klaus Friedland, my great friend and mentor, Klaus died in 2010. He was born in 1920. And he wrote, I've got it near my desk here, he wrote a long essay on that one picture, and it's of George Giza, and it's the only portrait of a Hanse merchant painted by Holbein, which shows the inside of his office. So it's the only picture showing the inside of the office in the London trading posts. And unfortunately, it was destroyed in the Great Fire of London, 1666. So we no longer have that room. But Klaus wrote an essay of 12,000 words because he could extract from there all the symbolism and the trade and the bookshelf. He could tell us so much about the Hanse and England through one picture. I was very privileged to have such a teacher.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can give you more a word to, or the possibility to give us a comment. So we have so many participants here.
Yes.
If you like to give us your comments, and maybe you have a special idea or a question for Paul. I would have a
if
question,
I may,
but I do not want to stop. Please feel free.
If I may, Ward. Richard, I think we've met, but you won't remember. This was a talk in Lübeck, I think, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago or so, on a similar topic. I've forgotten if it was at the Hanse Museum.
Yes.
It would have been. Would you like to say a few words about it? Because I'm in Hamburg. I always recommend people to take that hour's drive to Lübeck. Yes. And to walk around the Hanse Museum, which I think is a fantastic exhibition.
Yes.
And I just wonder if you want to share a few views on that.
Yes, I do know. I was lucky enough 1 year in Hamburg at the dinner in the evening. I sat next to the lady who's the director of the Hanse Museum in Lübeck, and we got on very well. And I visited and gave a talk, as you say, and you go around the museum, and one of the biggest spaces in the museum is of London. It just shows you how important London was for the German Hanse. And I know it's got a nice cafe as well, but to be honest, I can't remember. I gave a talk in one of the rooms there, and there's a very good representation of Novgorod as well. It's certainly very well worth visiting. I know a lot of good research is going on there because, as I said, the director of the Baltic History Study Department there is called Angela Huang, Huang, and she came to Lynn in 2018 to give a talk on the last Hanseatic Parliament, 1669, and the legacy of it. So it's a busy centre, a good museum, and a busy centre of research as well. And in a complex of buildings which have been very tastefully reshaped to make the museum. It's a good mixture of old and new. And I would certainly recommend it. Unfortunately, I wish I had been invited. Klaus Friedland had died before it opened. His wife, Eva, Professor Eva Friedland, wrote to me. She was invited. Klaus Friedland had a wonderful library. Of course, you can imagine. He donated that to the Hanse Museum in Lübeck. And Eva was invited to the opening with her daughter. I wish I had been, because Angela Merkel opened it. So I wish I could have gone to that. But yes, it's a busy place, and I'd highly recommend it. Once this epidemic goes away, maybe I can come to Hamburg again, which I very much like the Maritime Museum in Hamburg. I shall certainly have friends there, so I'll certainly come to Hamburg. And Lübeck's not very far. You just go to the railway station. It's only an hour on the train, isn't it? So Lübeck and Hamburg are quite close. And of course, you could say that Lübeck and Hamburg, they came to an agreement in 1241. to cooperate, mainly for trade, but also against pirates. And some people say the Hanseatic League, the German Hanse, began in 1241 with the pact or the treaty between Lübeck and Hamburg.
That's very interesting. Okay, I could read on the chat that Corinna would almost decided to go to the King's Lynn Festival in May, on the 12th of May. So already can.
I was fascinated. I was fascinated by what you said. I knew of the Hansa League. I'll put my camera on. I knew of the Hansa League, but all the implications it had, I wasn't aware of all of that. And I think that would be really fascinating to partake in the festival.
Yes, the Hansa Festival is on the 12th of June this year in King's Lynn. And there's a website, the King's Lynn and West Norfolk Borough website. But if you have any problems, just contact me and I can make sure you get a program. We have a meeting in 2 weeks to finalize the program. And I'm sure it will be a nice weekend.
Could you repeat where I can find the program then? What's the website?
It's the Borough Council of King's Lynn and West Norfolk.
Okay.
And there'll also be a newsletter because I'm regularly in touch with Stefania Bischoff, who is the chief executive of the new Hansa in Lübeck. She has an office next door to the Bürgermeister, and she's going to post in the Hansa newsletter the details of King's Lynn Hansa Festival. Okay. So if you look at www.hansa.org, you can find all sorts of stuff about all the towns, including King's Lynn. www.hansa.org. Yep. So King's Lynn is getting stuff through. We're trying to get stuff through. So the whole world of Hansa world knows about King's Lynn. And I made a film last year, the King's Lynn Festival, not Hansa, the music festival. I was lumbered with directing a film of 42 minutes, and it's called King's Lynn, A Glorious Festival Town. It's all about historic buildings, medieval King's Lynn, partly about the Hansa, and Stephanie is putting it on the website, the Hansa website, so all the towns can have access to YouTube and see this 42-minute film about medieval Lynn. And remember this, that a lot of our great buildings here in King's Lynn, where did the money come from? Well, most of it came from trade with the Hansa.
Also, I was very much impressed on the fact that you had one of the first Shakespeare theatres.
Yes, we have a Shakespeare. The Guildhall is the oldest working theatre in England. And the first play there is 1445. And no other building in England has such a long history of the playhouse as St. George's Guildhall. And we haven't proved it, but the circumstantial evidence is great that Shakespeare played there in 1593. And we have a pressure group in Lynn called the Shakespeare Guildhall Trust, who are trying to push all this. But I'm a great supporter. I'm on the history research group, and I do research for them. It's one of the we have two Guildhalls. And Lynn, like Lübeck, is very much a town of brick. We don't have much stone. The Minster is stone, but Lynn is a brick town. It was in the 15th century. Lynn is really a brick town, largely of the 14th and 15th centuries. But we were founded in 1101 by the bishops of Norwich. That's why for 500 years it was called Bishop's Lynn, until Henry VIII changed all that.
So weren't the bricks the ballast which was carried by the ships when they were empty? And
yes,
I think we have this phenomenon in Wismar as well. We have the Dutch bricks, which are smaller size than the usual.
And in King's Lynn today, Walter, and lots of other stuff, lots of metal came from Danzig copper and so on into Lynn as ballast. Today,
Right.
I'm a member of the King's Lynn Port Authority, and when a ship leaves the port of Lynn in ballast, it's all very boring, because in the past you had all these interesting things, brasses and metals, and salt was used as ballast as well. Today, ballast is seawater. You get into the North Sea, the master pulls a lever and it's seawater. So ballast is no longer interesting.
That's right. Okay, if somebody would like to say where you are based and how do you find this meeting tonight, and I would be very interested in where you are based from, where you are switched from with us tonight, if you want to tell us. I'm very curious about that. Some of our participants already told us where they are based, and
I'm relatively close to King's Lynn. I'm in Norwich.
Oh, that's very easy for you to get there on the 12th
going
of
to
June.
the festival.
Now I understand
would be an
your
easy step.
plans. Right, I envy you.
You can also type your location in our chat if you don't want to.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
so I wrote it in chat, but it may have gone too far back now. I would just like to ask if there are names of any specific musicians who went from England to the other Hanse towns, or whether there are specific names of German or Polish composers that visited England.
No, it tells us about groups going, individual musicians, and also groups of actors. Tells us about them doing these things. But they may be, because I don't know all the I'm not an expert, but the sources I've looked at, what I've seen, they don't give individual names. It was mainly, I think, it was happening in the 17th century mainly, rather than earlier. And maybe I'll relook. There's in 1624, a violinist from Lübeck went to London and stayed at the Hanseatic trading post and played in London. But I don't think it gave his name. So I'm sorry about that. But all I can tell you is I know it was happening, but I haven't got any specific names. It's an area of research which would be good to do. The early cultural exchanges. It would be very good to do that.
Thank you.
Shall I say something?
Yeah, please say.
Okay. I come from Hertford, in Hertfordshire. And I've actually been to Hamburg because Hertford is twinned with Wildeshausen. So we used to do school exchanges between the two, and on one of the day's outings we went to Hamburg, but I don't know a lot about that area. It was just that I went as a teacher on a school exchange.
Next time you can visit.
Taking pupils,
Yeah.
Right.
King's Lynn is twinned with a German town called Emmer. I don't know if you've heard of it. Emmerich am Rhein. Emmerich am Rhein. It's just over the Dutch border on the River Rhine. I have been there. When I was mayor, I was guest there. It's a small town. It's not as big as King's Lynn, and it joined the Hanse in 1364, but it was in the orbit of Cologne. The smaller towns had to join the Hanse if they were going to really do trade, if their trade was going to prosper. So Emmerich and King's Lynn got together 40 years ago because we were Hanseatic towns.
Well, my parents got married in Emmerich.
Oh.
From Coesfeld, which is also a Hanseatic town, not far from
Right.
And
very good.
Yes.
Interesting.
Hello, I'd like to ask a question. I'm from Southeast London at the moment. Very interesting talk. What caused the Hanseatic League to cease operations? I was just wondering what caused the demise of what had been such a successful enterprise.
Yes, it was mainly to do with the growth of nationalism of European nation states. Elizabeth I, the English got very, as a nation state, got very resentful of foreign merchants having privileges in England. So Elizabeth I in the 1590s expelled the Hanse. They did come back. Then the Russian Tsars expelled the Hanse in 1494. Ivan IV expelled the Hanse from Novgorod. Of course, by the 17th century, Sweden became a great Baltic power. And as you know, during the 30 Years' War, invaded the continent, Northern Europe. And well, Walter knows more than I do, but I think Wismar was under Swedish control for quite a long time. And so it was the rise of nation states challenging the Hanse. And the second reason was, as more competition with other countries came up, the Hanseatic League wasn't, there was disagreements within it. For example, Cologne always liked England. Cologne was an industrial town. It sold lots of things to England, including wine, and took in English goods. Cologne never wanted to make enemies of the English, whereas Lübeck, on the salt fleets coming back from Spain and France, La Rochelle. La Rochelle, by the way, is the only French member of the new Hanseatic League. On the salt ships coming back, the English pirates attacked it, especially in 1449 was the biggest, and Lübeck lost most of the ships. By the 15th century, Lübeck and England were enemies almost. Danzig liked England as well. So within the Hanse, Hamburg eventually, in the early 16th century, allowed an English group called the English Merchant Adventurers to move from Antwerp to Hamburg to actually be in a Hanseatic city. And Lübeck couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe this was happening. So division within the Hanse was another reason. And by 1669, only Bremen, Lübeck, and Hamburg were really sticking together. So the last Hanseatic Parliament or Assembly was in 1669, and only 9 cities attended the meeting.
If we're talking about the late 16th, early 17th century, of course, international trade is moving across the Atlantic.
Yes.
So the Hanse was very much North Sea, Baltic Sea, a bit into North and Central Europe, but trade really took off with the discovery of America. Yes. And that's where trade swung. So I think that's one of the reasons, apart from those that you mentioned, why it petered out, really, didn't it?
Yes. I mean, the Atlantic, it put the Atlantic seaboard states, Portugal and France and England in a very commanding position. So overall, you could say the Baltic and North Sea that was the Atlantic of the Middle Ages, and the development, the fastest development was, as you say, that was another reason, of course. But the Hanse was divided before that in the 15th century. The main Lübeck was the capital of the Hanse, but only informally. It was only recognized by the other towns as the chief city in 1419. But Lübeck, it was okay as long as Lübeck was seen to represent all the other towns. When Lübeck got too paranoid in a way about the English, because of all these piracies and so on, they had a crisis meeting in Hamburg, and the other towns, Cologne, wanted Hamburg to become the Hanseatic leading city. And then people wanted Cologne to become. So there were lots of divisions happening because of individual interests. The Hanseatic League was once seen to be a very closely knit together thing. Nowadays, historians in Germany portray the Hanse as a very loose association. And they won't even use the word Hansetag or Parliament. They use the word now when they had the meetings in Lübeck mainly. They use the word assembly, and they talk about the Hanse as an urban community. So this sort of hard edge of partly political, economic powerhouse has been sort of substituted for a much looser organisation. But it may swing back again in future years. But I've tried to go along in my book with a more recent interpretation of the Hanse as more of a loose organisation. But there's no doubt about it, the Hanse with their ships are a major element in the development of the European economy. And the new Hanse, when it started in 1980, the Baltic states, cities in the Baltic states began to join. It's seen by many in the new Hanse that their legacy is the medieval Hanse. They see themselves as the past is the future. But it's all very interesting. But Hamburg and England have always been very close, of course, and the shipping between Lynn, England and Hamburg was quite substantial in the 15th century. Whereas with Lübeck were the early runners. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Lübeck was the main, they were the main merchants. The Hanse from Lübeck were in Lynn and Boston more than any others. But by 1400, it was mainly the Danzigers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Slowly, it will be time to finish our event.
So, Romana, how about our time? Is there still someone who wants to ask a question?
Very quick.
I have still some more questions, but I think it's
time.
Time.
Mm-hmm. Now, who had the last question? There was. Okay, please ask, Leslie.
A very quick one. Has Brexit created any administrative problems for the current Hanse?
An interesting question. I don't think so. We seem to be in communication with Lübeck and the other Hanseatic towns as we were before Brexit. And so I would say no. In fact, I know my friends in Hamburg think the Hanse, the new Hanse is all the more important because of Brexit. It hasn't presented any obstacles as far as I can see, which is very pleasing as an urban alliance, as a city. Of course, it's a city alliance, isn't it? But it needs to get stronger now. We've had a bad time the last 2 years, like other organizations, and we really need to try and develop commercial and cultural connections. The past is the inspiration, but we're working for the future.
And with this positive note, we will finish today's presentation. I would just like to say thank you, a big thank you to Dr. Richards and Walter and to you all to join. Our next event is on the 31st of March. And Walter, maybe just 1 or 2 words, what are we going to do in the next one? Zu jeder Kunst gehören zwei, it will be in German.
Oh yes, this is an interesting, I hope this will be an interesting event. I have established a contact to the director of the Barlach Museum in Güstrow, which is based in Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, where I live. And I contacted her. This is Magdalena Schulz, and she told me that she will give a talk about Barlach, but not only. And Barlach may be known to many of you. He lived in the beginning of the 20th century, and he created the hanging angle, and there are some of these sculptures also at Tate Gallery. So this will be an art, more or less a talk about art, and zu jeder Kunst gehören zwei. This means this is these are the words of Barlach himself. And Yes, I can't tell you more now.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's really great.
But I'm
It's-
looking forward
Yeah.
to that event, and I hope it will be of interest
Yeah,
for many
it's
of us.
again, as always, we are trying to have these connections between Germany, or let's say German-speaking countries, and England or the UK. If you want to read the book and discuss it on the 28th of July, this is the book, The Kanzlerin, the Chancellor, also in English, quite interesting, because, you know, Angela finished this year. She was an interesting person, is still an interesting person, so maybe that will be interesting for us. And as always, thank you so much for your participation, and we hope to see you soon and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you for
All
the talk.
best.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.